Next tonight, the Pokemon Go craze. The
Craze causing chaos. Tonight, Pokemon problems persist.
People across America and even the world are taking to the streets.
I don't know who created Pokemon Go.
No matter if you're a seasoned Pokemon fan or you wouldn't know the difference between a Pikachu and a Sonic the Hedgehog, there's no way you haven't heard of Pokemon Go, or as fans like to call it, Pogo. In the summer of 2016, no matter where you went, you were bound to run into people playing the game, getting exposed to memes, or seeing headlines about how players had endangered themselves and others by falling off of cliffs, causing stampedes over Vaporeons, or wandering into nuclear power plants. Not even tuning into politics could save you from hearing about Pokemon Go. Despite the negative news and literal crimes committed by gangs luring players, the release of the game was one of the best times ever to be a Pokemon fan. Finding other Pokemon fans as an adult in day-to-day life isn't easy, but at the height of Pokemon Go, you could find them everywhere. You could bond with almost anyone running around outside with a phone, or strangers who'd ask you all about these Pokemans and why everyone was so obsessed with them. Yet the Pokemon Go craze didn't even last an entire Pokemon generation. People were wondering if Pokemon Go was still a thing a couple months after its release, and it wasn't because the game was just a fad or a bad idea. If you ask anyone why they wanted to play the game, they'll probably reply that they always loved Pokemon. Most players grew up watching the show, playing the games, or collecting Pokemon cards, such as myself, and playing Pogo brought them back to their childhood, when they still had hopes and dreams. Very relatable, I know. What they probably won't tell you is that they played it because they really loved Niantic, the company that created Pogo, or that the game was literally so amazing that they couldn't stop playing it. Pogo lost a significant amount of its player base because Niantic made the game worse with almost every update, shut down criticism of them, and prioritized cash grabs and monetization. It's a widespread belief that the game has succeeded in spite of Niantic and not because of them, and that the game pretty much entirely runs off of the fumes of nostalgia and Pokemon's incredibly strong brand. Despite fans making the best of it and hoping for Niantic to change for the better, the fumes are running drier and drier every year. This is a story of one game squandering the fan base of the world's largest franchise and proving that profits can't earn you respect from your player base. But what is Pokemon Go? Why was everyone so obsessed with it? And where are the Pokemon even going? Pogo is an augmented reality mobile game by the developer Niantic. After the Pokemon Company collaborated with Google on an April Fool's joke in 2014, where users could search for 150 Pokemon on Google Maps and earn Pokemon Master business cards upon completing the Google Pokédex, they wanted to turn the Google Maps Pokemon game into a real thing. Enter Niantic, one of Google's spin-offs, to bring the quintessential Pokemon experience of catching them all to smartphones. Pogo's main gameplay loop is tied to moving around outside. As you walk, your avatar moves along the app's map, which is a Pokemon-fied version of your actual surroundings, aka literally just Google Maps with a fancy overlay. As you continue your adventure, Pokemon randomly spawn, and you can interact with Pokestops to get resources like Pokeballs. Pokestops are mostly landmarks like murals, signs, or statues of well-known locations like McDonald's Fountain of Obesity. However, some Pokestops are also gyms. But instead of battling a gym leader for a badge like in every other Pokemon franchise, you can take over the gym for your team by battling other players' Pokemon. Okay, if you put it like that, I get it. The game doesn't sound very fun. But exploring your surroundings in a way you wouldn't normally, or joining local communities to do events together, is undeniably charming, especially if you're a lifelong Pokemon fan. That's why fans put up with Niantic's insane monetization of Pogo, that paywalls most rare Pokemon and requires you to spend money unless you want to play the game obsessively. Players even accepted bugs and disappointing features, like spawning Pokemon as an AR overlay of your camera's view and letting them interact with real-world objects, which is totally not awkward for large legendary Pokemon. Sure, Dialga, 17-foot tall god of time, come sit in my tiny living room kitchen. If you ask any Pokemon fan about the beginning of July in 2016, they'll probably tell you it was the closest humanity has ever gotten to world peace. Videos following Pogo's release capture the vibe of bringing people together from different backgrounds, ages, and Pokemon fan levels all together. It didn't matter if you grew up playing Red or Blue, or if you're a brand new Pokemon trainer. Everyone just wanted to catch whatever Pokemon they can get their hands on, unless it was a bird. But wholesome memories aside, Pokemon Go's launch was beyond cursed and definitely not what Niantic had promised us. Let's review the original Pokemon Go trailer, which now has almost 50 million views on YouTube. We can see players actively searching for Pokemon in both urban and rural environments, trading Pokemon with one another, 1v1 trainer battles, team battles, and finally a gigantic crowd challenging Mewtwo all together in a raid. All things you'd expect in a Pokemon game, but more immersive because Pogo is using augmented reality. The trailer promised to give fans nothing short of the closest thing to Pokemon in real life, besides maybe aliens shaped like Pikachu, and promoted Pogo as a game that could turn anything you do outside into a fun adventure. Anyways, when I rewatched this trailer while writing this video, I couldn't stop laughing. Essentially, none of the features shown in this trailer were in the game at launch. Raid bosses wouldn't be added at least for another year, trading wasn't added until 2018, PvP battles weren't added until 2019, and the team PvP has been abandoned in Niantic's basement, never to be spoken about again. I'm aware that expecting Niantic to have seamless AR integration so good that Eevee is jumping out of my phone screen and tickling my nose is incredibly unrealistic. However, there's a reason why AR mobile games give people the same ick as those creepy AI cat videos, and that's because the technology is still awkward. But Pokemon fans weren't really into Pogo for fancy buzzword tech. They wanted the game to satisfy the sense of wonder the Pokemon franchise gave them as kids. Instead, we got, well, this. It first released in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Kind of weird Japan wasn't on this list considering they're the birthplace of Pokemon, right? Anyways, instead of playing the game at midnight on July 6th as promised, the app was for some reason not available in those countries for many players. If you were lucky enough to download the game, you either encountered a never-ending loading screen or got stuck in the "your account doesn't exist" loop of hell. If you prevailed and somehow got into the game, you were incredibly lucky to catch any Pokemon at all and not just see an empty map or get kicked out because the servers were constantly crashing. This got so much worse because players who couldn't wait until Pogo released in their country circumvented the Australian App Store's region lock and added to the traffic. Niantic also never really solved their load balancing problems long term, so with every new batch of countries getting Pogo, their servers went down again. Hey, you know, at least Niantic was practicing inclusion because everyone got the same crappy experience. In Niantic's defense, Pogo was one of the most anticipated games ever and had around 200 million active players during its launch, so a few hiccups are par for the course. However, instead of bugs getting fixed, things got progressively worse. Fans even made websites to track if the Pogo servers were up and compiled pages of known issues and how to deal with them in Reddit posts. Crashes and the game not rendering things correctly because it lost the GPS signal were annoying but normal. The game's resolution being wonky and the Pokédex not working on Android were pretty game-breaking. For some bizarre reason, the Grimer model had a particular problem where it would bug out and even affect other Pokemon next to it. However, bugs affecting microtransactions were just plain unfair. When buying in-game currency Pokecoins, Pogo would sometimes freeze, and your purchase would go through multiple times unless you immediately noticed and quit the game. Buying items in Pogo's shop with Pokecoins and immediately using them was kind of risky because you couldn't guarantee that the servers would actually stay up long enough to use them, especially with the case of the lure module. Similarly, players paid for incubators to hatch eggs only to never see the Pokemon after they allegedly had hatched. Where did they go, Niantic, and what did you do with them? Luckily, players got refunds after pestering Niantic's support. We'll get to their stellar customer support later, don't you worry. But players who invested time to earn these items in-game and couldn't provide a transaction ID to prove they had them were at Niantic's mercy to get their items back. Especially because Niantic often took down their servers and rest in Pokeballs if you used an item before they did. Thankfully, Pogo's server issues finally stabilized after a month, and with it came in reports of it breaking every mobile game record to date. Interestingly, as a result of this, Nintendo's stocks almost doubled in the first 2 weeks of July 2016 because people thought they made Pogo. I get where they're coming from because Nintendo and the Pokemon Company helped fund Niantic, but we don't know the extent of their involvement. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there about Nintendo and the Pokemon Company forcing tie-ins with the releases, but honestly, even if Nintendo was shadow puppeteering Niantic, it might actually be a good thing. Just look at the awful monetization system Animal Crossing Pocket Camp had. Breathing in that game caused money and everything was a loot box. But because Nintendo didn't want any flack for kids gambling, they re-released the full game without microtransactions. Anyways, Nintendo announced that their earnings from Pogo would be limited and their stock dropped again at the end of July. But Pogo's impact didn't stop there. It caused a resurgence in popularity amongst other things such as the Pokemon anime, video games, and especially the card games. For instance, I found out recently that this first edition Lugia that I had as a kid, well, apparently it's worth actual money now. Take that, Beanie Babies. Pokemon cards were the real treasure trove all along. That being said, the cryptofication of Pokemon cards is a topic for another video. So how did Pogo actually hold up once people were able to play it? Well, it was fun, but it didn't live up to the expectations set by the trailer, and compared to other Pokemon games, it felt overly simplistic. After creating your character, you were free to explore the Pogo map, but instead of seeing the current Pokemon spawns, you could only pick from one of the 3 original starter Pokemon: Squirtle, Bulbasaur, or Charmander. Or, if you were a cool kid, you could ignore them for a bit and then go catch a Pikachu. Well, did it matter which one you chose? Absolutely not. People made a huge deal out of it and turned getting Pikachu into a Mew under the truck like urban legend where you had to walk away from the other starters for a certain amount of time to summon the Pikachu. But in the end, almost everyone transferred their starter Pokemon after forgetting that it was supposed to be special. Transferring Pokemon to Professor Willow gives you candy, but in exchange the Pokemon is gone forever. I wonder what Professor Willow is doing with all of those Rattatas and Pidgeys. He's grinding them up, isn't he? Unethical meatpacking implications aside, candy is your only way of evolving and leveling up Pokemon. Usually you'd have to collect candy for a specific Pokemon by catching as many of them as you can and sending them off to Willow's farm, and I want to give props to Pogo where it's due. The catching mechanics translate really well to mobile, when it worked. As Pokemon spawn on the map, you tap them, yeet balls at the Pokemon, and pray. If you wanted to increase your odds and get more experience, you can go for an excellent throw and spin the ball to curve it. Getting excellent throws consistently is almost an exact science within the fandom, since hitboxes and catch circles don't always correlate perfectly with the Pokemon's size. Though that is kind of nitpicky in comparison to all the issues players had at the beginning of Pogo, when just tapping on a Pokemon could trigger the loading screen of doom, Pokemon would just ignore Pokeballs, or they would glitch to the ground after you successfully caught them. And all that hassle for the 100th Pidgey. Pidgeys, Rattatas, Zubats, and others were such common spawns that Pogo was basically defined by them. It sounds annoying, but then trainers figured out that the best strategy to level up in the game was to farm as many of them as possible and involve 500 while sobbing into your lucky egg. Getting this many Pokemon of the same type was even easier if you found a nest. Nests were places where species would aggregate around a large public area like a park. In the beginning, Pogo was also huge on spawning Pokemon in thematically fitting biomes. So a rare Dratini nest would be at a large fountain or river rather than a forest. The only annoying thing about nests is that some large areas like parks would be completely dominated by a single type of Pokemon until the nest rotated. Very yucky if it was a Rattata nest, for instance. Thankfully, Niantic implemented the switcheroo as a rotation, and users on the more serious Pogo subreddit, the Self Road, compiled a list of nest changes so trainers could anticipate what Pokemon their nests would spawn. The very first weeks of Pogo were marked by crowds of people swarming large public areas that were easily accessible by foot. While most trainers were mindful of their surroundings and pretty peaceful, it only took one person yelling "Dragonite" for everyone within ear range to stampede in that direction, hoping to catch it. I guess the trailer wasn't lying about everything. In some densely packed areas like Central Park, Venusaur, Charizard, and even Vaporeon spawns cause stampedes. You know, I definitely understand the Vaporeon stampede. Did you know that in terms of human Pokemon... Okay, I'm just kidding. Thankfully, no one ever got seriously hurt, just emotionally scarred when they couldn't make it in time. But some players literally risked their lives and others to get to the Pokemon as fast as possible. When Snorlax spawned in a Taipei park, players rushed through a close-by major road and barely avoided getting hit by traffic. So how did Niantic decide where to even spawn the Pokemon to begin with? Well, Pogo's spawns depended on a mix of finding areas with high cell phone traffic, so high-traffic urban areas get more things to do, and also more data for Niantic about interesting local landmarks. The latter is especially important since players submitted points of interest. Niantic turned them into Pokestops. Whenever you're near a Pokestop, you can spin it to gain resources like Pokeballs, berries, and potions. Well, how did Niantic decide where to put the Pokestops? It's surprisingly simple. They're user submitted based on local landmarks, which can be anything from public parks and libraries to weird pieces of art, though Niantic provides a full list of acceptable Pokestops on their website. It doesn't work this way anymore, but in the past you would actually have to take an exam in order to prove a submitted Pokestop. Kind of like a Pokemon Go driver's license or something. Anyways, because Pokestops are user submitted, they're also named and photographed by players. Naturally, this has resulted in a lot of, how should I say this, interesting Pokestops, such as many Pokestops featuring religious figures with humorous and inappropriate captions, Pokestops of graveyards and people's graves or a literal baby cemetery, things that technically qualify as local landmarks but probably shouldn't, such as the doggy poo dumpster or the grotesque Pikachu ride. Definitely Nintendo licensed, right? Other Pokestops were of things that were just like completely nonsensical, such as a decapitated toy baby head on a stick lawn ornament, or a literal living crocodile. Okay, it would have been kind of funny if Niantic was somehow able to hook the crocodile up to a GPS tracker. It could have become the very first mobile Pokestop. You just don't want to be the first person to get eaten by it. Before we get too deep in, there is one teensy tiny thing I should mention. Pokemon Go wasn't actually Niantic's first hit mobile game. They were well known beforehand for making the mobile game Ingress in 2012. In fact, Ingress's success was one of the biggest reasons they were able to get the green light from the Pokemon Company to use the Pokemon IP. Ingress's biggest relation to Pogo is that both games are GPS based and use Google Maps data and local landmarks. Ingress's version of Pokestops were instead called portals, and the gameplay was mostly capture the portal style with a secret agent aesthetic overlaid it. It's notable because all of the initial Pokestops in Pogo were grandfathered in from Ingress. And at least for a little while, only Ingress players were even able to submit new portals which would become Pokestops. This actually resulted in a lot of drama between the Pogo community and the Ingress community. Mostly because some Pogo players would power level an account in Ingress specifically so they could submit portals, probably trying to get a Pokestop of their lawn flamingo. Sadly, these days Niantic is a lot better at quality control, so unfortunately we lost Pokestops like Target Red Balls to the annals of time. Actually, Ingress wasn't even Niantic's first mobile application. They had an even earlier one known as Field Trip. Field Trip was a virtual tour guide that could recommend points of interest based on your current GPS location, and these would actually be the earliest incarnations of Pokestops. For many smaller communities, receiving extra attention from Pokemon Go ended up being a double-edged sword. Local businesses often flourished because trainers frequented them on longer Pogo sessions. You can't just hunt Pokemon without an ice latte, right? It's a universal law that good drinks increase shiny odds. Cafes and small shops celebrated becoming Pokestops or even gyms during the first few weeks of Pogo because they were guaranteed to get more patrons. Some zoos and gardens across the world even hosted Pogo events, posting the current spawns online and reducing ticket prices for players. However, for residents, this newfound attention soon became a nightmare. Parks and other landmarks around the world started to fear Pokemon Go and appealed to Niantic to remove spawns because some trainers thought they were playing Pokemon Go GTA Edition. Ueno Park, one of Tokyo's most popular parks and home to a large Dratini nest, partially banned Pogo around its temple grounds in 2016 because players kept bothering visitors and leaving trash behind. To farm as many Dratinis as possible, some players would squat around the park's pond endlessly and use power outlets that were intended for staff. Pogo is infamously battery hungry, and it's a meme that you can spot a player just by the many external battery packs they carry. Other parks had to replant huge patches of grass because players were trampling all over it and ignoring the "do not walk on grass" signs. Some Japanese gardens in the US were even vandalized in the name of Pogo teams. The best and worst example of Pokemon Go community almost ruining a town was the Belgian village of Lilo. The village only had 35 people, but for some reason it was a hotspot for rare spawns. Naturally, this caused players to flock to it by the literal thousands and overcrowded the community so badly that residents couldn't even use their driveways anymore. How kind. And many of the trainers weren't behaving very nicely either. They played at all hours of the day, harassed locals, peed everywhere, got drunk, and vandalized anything from art on the streets to cars. The Reddit thread about the ordeal is honestly terrifying, and what's worse is that many players disagreed with the village banning the game from 11 PM to 7 AM. I guess they'd rather have them ban the game completely, like the small French town whose mayor declared that Pokemon spawns are an anarchical settlement because Niantic didn't ask him beforehand, and I quote, is using the whole world as their playground. Reading more about it, it sounds like he wanted to save his residents from becoming addicted to Pokemon Go. It's a little bit weird, but you know, honestly, go off, King. I'm here for it. Please fight Niantic for us. What was happening in the other cities though? Well, wherever Pokemon Go players went, pandemonium followed. Muggings at gunpoint. A streamer being mugged while playing the game while their chat probably was spamming PogChamp. Robbers camping around Pokestops because they realized the average Pogo player is completely clueless, which resulted in an official statement by Pokemon, but things kept escalating from there. A knife fight breaking out over the game in a German park. Players literally jumping out of moving vehicles to try and get rare spawns that their friends had just driven past. Multiple players, and I mean multiple, kept finding dead bodies. And maybe the craziest was this guy that was stabbed while playing the game after asking a stranger with their phone out if they were also playing. After being stabbed in the shoulder, he decided to continue playing. I gotta say, you know, you gotta respect the grind, right? Accidents while playing the game were so common that the Pokemon Go death tracker was created. Pokestops are meant to be easily accessible by the public. That's basically their one golden rule besides don't be a living crocodile. But a lot of them are in pretty dangerous locations like into the rock path into the ocean risky, or we're going to jail but without Officer Jenny risky because we just broke into a private cemetery. Pogo kept edging players just a little bit closer because the Pokestop or gym are just a bit too far into that decrepit Victorian pier or on one of the remote and polar bear ridden islands without a Wi-Fi connection. Some players were so engulfed in the game that they snuck into a nuclear power plant in Ohio, tried to enter containment zones in Fukushima, and almost crossed the border into North Korea. French players even started a public campaign urging Niantic to remove a popular but dangerous Pokestop in an abandoned historic building after a 16-year-old died and 2 other teens got injured while trying to circumvent the barricaded entrance. Don't worry though, trainers, the San Francisco police are here to take care of us. They released a public PSA about how Pokemon Go fever is hitting the streets of San Francisco, with such important tips as watching where you're going and don't walk into trees because they hurt. I've spent my entire life walking into trees and now I finally know not to do it. Thank you. Don't worry, I'm sure I'll still keep walking into those axe-wielding psychos though. Speaking of police, many players got into trouble with them because of late-night Pogo hijinks. As it turns out, it does look a little bit fishy loitering in your car in a parking lot next to a park at 2 in the morning. Apparently, this was such a common experience for the police that they started preemptively asking fishy people late at night if they were playing the game. Niantic, for their own part, also had their own fair share of Pokemon No's. Does playing in traffic sound fun? Well, Niantic has one better. How about playing on train tracks trying to catch that elusive Dragonite? Not to mention that they hadn't paid any thought to the spawning of Pokemon in inappropriate locations. Meanwhile, a whole Greek island was marked as underwater and unplayable according to Niantic for years. Towns and cities weren't the only entities that were upset with Pokemon Go mania though. Boeing, for example, removed Pokemon Go from over 100 work phones and blacklisted it after an employee almost got hurt while trying to catch them all. It's because they care about safety, you know? That aged worse than Whitney's milk tank's milk. Apart from organizations being upset about employees playing Pogo on company time, Pogo also raised massive security concerns. Since the app tracks your location, encourages taking pictures, and accesses data on your phone, the Pentagon was allegedly worried about Pogo recording them, tracking their employees, or being used for spy recruitment, and banned it right after its release. I guess if Furby can't spy on them, neither can Pikachu. But that was actually all a hoax. They just encouraged staff to use common sense while playing on their personal device and maybe not catching Pokemon in secret areas. Meanwhile, almost every military base had their Pokestops, gyms, and spawns removed because civilian players kept wandering into them and it's a liability risk. Reportedly, the night following Pogo's release, Canadian military bases reported an influx of suspicious vehicles. Some were even driving directly into restricted areas. When the guards approached the cars, they saw multiple adults looking at their phones, explaining that they needed to catch mythical digital creatures so they could beat their kids at a mobile game. Yeah, so they were pretty confused, and honestly, the email correspondence is amazing. One officer literally suggested hiring a 12-year-old as a Pokemon Go consultant just so they could understand the game better. A few days later, some staff members had to walk around their base with Pogo running on their phones to identify Pokestops and gyms so they could kindly ask Niantic to delete them or move them to a public space nearby. Luckily, this story has a happy ending as the Admiral recommended moving the Pokestops and gyms to better locations. Ironically, the most important decision you had to make in the game wasn't whether or not to jump out of the backseat of your friend's car to catch that rare Dratini. Obviously, we're doing that, okay? We're doing it. No, it was pledging your allegiance to one of the 3 legendary birds. Pidgey, Zubat, and Spearow. Sorry, I meant Articuno, Zapdos, or Moltres, corresponding to the team's Mystic, Instinct, or Valor. Oh, and you also got a team leader, Blanche, Candela, and Spark. Honestly, I don't think anyone cares about these characters or even really remembers that they exist. I didn't even know this guy's name was Spark until I wrote this video. The most significant outcome of having to choose a team was that the player base didn't evenly split itself into neat thirds. It's commonly known now Mystic dominated, with Valor as a close second, and Team Instinct massively lagged behind. Now, Niantic has never officially released numbers on the player population, but polling done usually shows about 40% of the players were Mystic, 35% were Valor, and then the remaining 25% were Team Yellow. Why was there such a big difference? Well, no one really knows, though the community opinion is that blue and red are more popular colors than yellow. I also remember hearing a theory that it had something to do with the placement of the choice on the screen as well, since Mystic was in the middle. But that doesn't explain really why there was such a big difference between the yellow and red teams. Either way, Yellow Team became the butt of every joke, and was immortalized as the confused third head in that 3-headed dragon meme. While humorous, this is also one of the first signs that Niantic had no idea how to handle their community. Besides catching Pokemon, the other main thing you could do in the game was battling. This was actually in the game at launch, but only in the form of gyms. You remember those fun things that were one of the central gameplay mechanics in the console games? Unfortunately, Pogo Gyms on release were not great. Gyms are essentially Pokestops that you can add Pokemon to. Originally, gyms would need to be leveled up via a prestiging process. Gyms had a maximum level of 10, where 10 Pokemon could be added, 1 for each level. This meant that you would need to sit at a real-world location and battle Pokemon for what felt like forever. Players would learn to optimize this strategy using something called the bubble strat, as they called it, which cut the time to prestige a gym to level 10 from about an hour. That's right, a literal hour, down to just 10 minutes. Was I guilty of prestiging gyms at 3 in the morning under streetlights? Absolutely, and I'm proud of it. Once a gym was maxed out, players would fill it with the most annoying Pokemon to fight, usually Chansey and Snorlax, which had lots of health. For every Pokemon you had in a gym, per roughly 24 hours, you would be rewarded with 10 Pokecoins, with a maximum of 100 per day. Okay, so keep in mind, this is the only way to get free currency in the game, which, you know, credit to Niantic where credit is due. It's nice that there was a way to get free currency at all, but there was a big incentive created out of this to hold as many gyms as possible for your team. This was especially a problem for Team Instinct, as they always controlled the least number of gems and they had a really hard time holding any. Since gems were the only way to earn free Pokecoins, and one of the few truly competitive features in the game, they quickly became a pressure cooker for the most aggressive players to lose their minds over. On top of that, gyms were tied to real-world locations, which meant you could actually run into other players while at them. There are so many stories of players getting approached, threatened, or let's be real, the really scary one, flirted with. But I think that most people found the community to be overall pretty peaceful. Okay, but let's rewind a bit. So at this point we can establish a basic gameplay loop of the Pokemon catching minigame, spinning Pokestops, and if you really liked the game, battling gyms for 4 hours a day. But there was one more aspect to this. See, your real life location. Catching a few Pokemon and spinning a Pokestop takes all of around a minute. So naturally you would need to Pokemon go outside and walk around. Terrifying, I know. But I think that the message about exploring your environment and reconnecting with nature was actually a really nice message for the game to have. And oh boy, did Niantic love to talk about this message. They would shove it down your throat to let you know they have the moral high ground because going outside is good for you. And you know, if you lived in the city, things were good. And in some people's cases, they would actually have an access to a large cluster of spawns, Pokestops, and gyms, all from the convenience of their apartments. If only I were so lucky. But while all the city kids were having a ball, maybe a Pokeball, people who didn't live in dense urban areas were having a very different game experience. Remember how we talked about how Niantic does Pokemon spawns based on cell phone traffic? This means that in less populated areas, such as suburbs or worse, rural areas, there would be practically no spawns, gyms, or Pokestops. This meant you couldn't even really play the game. Like, yeah, I'm definitely exploring the beauty of nature, Niantic, because that's where you put all of the Pokemon. Thank you. It gets worse though. Remember the trailer they showed? Remember how it showed people in remote wilderness locations catching Pokemon? Remember how in the actual Pokemon games, all the locations you found Pokemon at were naturalistic? Such as hiking trails, caves, lakes, and forests? Anyways, all of that was completely and utterly impossible in the game. So much so for finding Charizard in the mountains, huh? There was one extremely strange and unexplained exception to this, which is that sometimes in extremely rural areas that weren't anywhere near Pokestops or gyms, players would find absolutely massive cluster spawns. I don't think anybody knows why though. The problems with rural play didn't end there though, because rural gyms were also a nightmare. While city gyms might change teams multiple times a day, rural gyms have the opposite problem where your Pokemon can become permanently trapped in them. Apparently the record for the most time stuck in a gym is this poor Dragonite at over 2,000 days. It's a really bizarre oversight by Niantic that they didn't just add a recall Pokemon from gym button. However, as the famous saying goes, adversity gives way to innovation. And it wouldn't take Pokemon Go's most enthusiastic players long to figure out the best strategy for the game. Pokemon Go drive your car somewhere else. Despite the entire premise of the game being to, walk around and explore your surroundings, many players who wanted to actively play the game found this inconvenient. And the primary solution was, of course, to go somewhere where the Pokemon were plentiful. However, some players would take this a step further. Instead of just driving to a park where they could slowly walk around, catch some Pokemon, enjoy the scenery, they realized there was a much more lucrative offer for them: parking lots. That's right, the concrete jungles were some of the absolute best places to find Pokemon. Well, parking lots, gas stations, office buildings, strip malls, and other hyper-urban areas to name a few. So these players would happily drive back and forth the local Costco and Kroger, getting as many spawns as possible. These sorts of players would come under fire by the community for playing the game in a way that it wasn't intended. However, can you really blame them? Like, Niantic decided to put all the Pokemon in parking lots. You can't expect people to not play in parking lots. As a result of this, a little over a month after the release of the game, Niantic would add a warning for players who are traveling over a certain speed. This was intended to deter players from playing and driving at the same time, which of course it didn't. And no doubt it was partially motivated by the accidents. Driver distracted by Pokemon Go kills elderly woman in Japan. August 25th, 2016. A driver apparently distracted by Pogo has killed one woman and seriously injured another in Japan, marking the first fatal accident involving the augmented reality app in the country. Local police said that the driver, reportedly a 39-year-old farmer, didn't notice the two women were crossing the street because he was playing the game. One of the victims, in her early 70s, died at the scene from a broken neck, while the other suffered a broken hip and is now in the hospital. Accidents like these caused towns like Occoquan, that had become an afternoon hotspot for Pokemon hunting in the first few weeks, actually put up signs reminding players that it's called Pokemon Go and not Pokemon Go drive your car into people and kill them. According to a 2018 study done at the University of Tokyo titled Effect of Pokemon Go on Incidents of Fatal Traffic Injuries, Pogo didn't actually lead to an increase in traffic accidents. Okay, now hold on. Let's take a look at the conflict of interest statement. Oh my god, I knew it. Niantic funded the whole thing. Okay, just kidding. I changed it to say that. Another 2018 study at Purdue University titled Death by Pokemon Go disagreed with the Tokyo University's paper. They found that accidents increased by around 25% near Pokestops in Tippecanoe, Indiana, 5 months after Pogo's release, costing the county more than $25 million and costing 2 people their lives. If you extrapolate this to the entire country, you come up with this shocking figure of around $2 to $7 billion in damage, 150,000 car crashes, and 256 deaths. Although the authors admitted that they're not sure that the extrapolation was actually accurate. Still, that's a staggering amount of chaos caused by people chasing after digital rats. While some players were driving their way to Pokemon riches or car accidents, others turned to a different method: spoofing. Location spoofing tricks the game into thinking you're somewhere else entirely. Early on, it was completely rampant. Most hacked clients let you walk with an on-screen joystick as seen in this video, or teleport using a Google Maps overlay. If you lived in the middle of nowhere with 2 Pidgeys and Rattata, Spoofing meant that you could suddenly be strolling through New York Times Square with all the spawns, Pokestops, and gyms you could have ever wanted at your fingertips. Spoofers argued that spoofing leveled the playing field for rural players in particular, that it let people travel for free, or just kept them from freezing to death. But spoofers also made things miserable for real players by locking down gyms, sometimes with multiple accounts, and later on ruining showcases. Now, okay, so here's the thing. Is spoofing cheating? Yes, it is absolutely cheating. But it's also Pokemon Go, guys. Come on, like, the game's not exactly Olympic level sports or something. Personally, I never tried spoofing, but I also don't think that people that spoof deserve to be executed on the spot like some people do in the community. That being said, please do not spoof. Niantic constantly runs ban waves and is also a really easy way to get a virus on your phone. So unless you want your account banned and your phone turned into a crypto mining toaster, don't spoof. There were some pretty strange discoveries made as a result of players spoofing though, such as that North Korea bizarrely has some Pokestops. Spoofing's more innocent cousin was the Pokemon Map Tracker. Map trackers let you see Pokemon spawns in real time overlaid on Google Maps. Think of it kind of like ethical Pokemon stalking in a way. Players would use the tracker to check around their city to see if there were any rare Pokemon like Snorlax or Dragonite, and then they were able to go outside and specifically target these Pokemon even if they were blocks away. Global trackers were shut down very early into the game's lifetime, but were absolutely glorious while they were available. Trackers still exist to this day, but now you have to pay to use them. The people that make them use bot networks, and they're usually only a map of an individual city rather than global. Oh, and they're also rife with scams and viruses, so please don't use them either. So the first summer of Pokemon Go was a chaotic, beautiful mess of server crashes, real-world danger, and players taking matters into their own hands. It was the game's golden age. It was fueled by chaos and nostalgia, and everybody loved it. But if the first few months were the honeymoon, the next chapter would be the slow, painful divorce. So the original state of the game on release was ultimately not very good, but many players, including myself, had high hopes that over time Niantic would be able to improve the game, possibly even reaching the state that was shown in the original trailer. Unfortunately, with few exceptions, most of the major updates to the game were disappointing from both a gameplay and fun perspective, increased the amount of time that you would need to spend playing the game by adding massive MMO-style tedious grinds, and of course, also massively increased monetization. One of the earliest and greatest examples of Niantic's terrible communication with their player base was the infamous minor text fixes update. In many of their earliest patch notes for the game, Niantic would simply write minor fixes or minor text fixes. This is pretty infuriating as at that time the game was pretty much unplayable. And later on, they would actually roll out major changes without making any announcement about it. One of the most controversial early features that was removed was the footprint tracker system. Originally, the nearby tracker showed you which Pokemon were in your area, but it wouldn't tell you exactly where they were. It just gave you a little silhouette and some mysterious paw prints. Naturally, the community would lose their minds trying to triangulate Dragonites and Snorlaxes like they were doing some sort of weird GPS seance. I'm not embarrassed to admit that I chased a Snorlax into a Walgreens parking lot at 11 p.m. It was the most alive I think I've ever felt, maybe. Basically, it was like Pokemon cryptid hunting and everybody loved it, so naturally Niantic would get rid of it. The 3-step tracker was replaced with a new sightings list. This list showed you which Pokemon were nearby, but that's basically all it did. There were no paw prints, there were no direction, no sense of how close you were, no 3 a.m. GPS seance to find Snorlax. Some players liked this because it made finding Pokemon easier, but other players like me enjoyed the mini game of actually trying to find the Pokemon. About a year after the game's launch, something strange started happening everywhere. Pokemon spawns, stops, and gyms began disappearing from university campuses all across the world. Now, it makes sense that Niantic would have to remove spawns from schools where children were under the age of 18, but universities are public spaces filled with adults. And more importantly, they had become core hubs of the Pogo community. Campuses are a lot like parks in that they're super walkable, oftentimes very pretty, and not to mention filled to the brim with gameplay. I played a lot of Pokemon Go while getting my PhD, and I always preferred to play on my university campus over going downtown. Most campuses lost everything. Others, bizarrely, still had spawns during the day but went dead at night, as if Niantic had installed a ghost mode curfew. Even public parks weren't immune. If a property owner nearby submitted a complaint, Niantic would oftentimes remove the spawn entirely, There were even people who were suspected of having spawns or stops removed as a part of trolling. Naturally, there was never any communication about why these things would happen because, I mean, well, it's Niantic, right? The only explanation players ever got was that property managers, like university staff, could submit removal requests. But that didn't explain why removals were sometimes selective, inconsistent, or invisible until it was too late. This devastated local communities and naturally forced people to play the game in less walkable areas, or they would become parking lot princesses like the aforementioned players. And don't forget, Niantic wants you to go outside, supposedly. Now, there's nothing more synonymous with a new Pokemon game than having loads and loads of new critters to collect, which has become like a borderline annual tradition in the franchise, along with the time-honored tradition of getting into internet forum arguments over which Pokemon generation is the best, which in my personal experience mostly has to do with when you were born. And anyways, come on guys, like it's totally obvious. Gen 2 is the best, except that it doesn't have Sylveon. Okay, so maybe it's not the best. I'm just kidding. I know people totally hate Gen 2, but this is exactly what I was talking about, right? Gen 2 was my first game, so it's my favorite one. Anyways, Niantic in their infinite wisdom knew that they would eventually need to add more Pokemon to Pogo in order to encourage players to keep playing and collecting. While you might argue that the game launched with only the original Kanto Pokemon because adding all of them would have been too complicated, it was probably a deliberate decision by Niantic. Gen 1 is by far the most nostalgic, to the chagrin of many people, but Gen 1 was also the beginning of the franchise, so it was kind of the natural starting point. Niantic clearly planned from the start that they could extend the content of the game by releasing new Pokemon over time. But what's interesting is that their release schedule changed massively over the years. In February of 2017, Pogo players awoke to over 100 new species of Pokemon being added to the game from the Johto region. The best one, by the way. Those 100 Pokemon would make up almost the entire Gen 2 dex, excluding a few oddballs such as legendaries or Smeargle. And this was an incredibly exciting time to be playing. In a lot of ways, it felt like it recaptured a bit of the hype before the initial release of the game. In October of the same year, a sneak preview of Gen 3 would drop with the ghost Pokemon Shuppet and Duskull becoming available. But players would say to themselves, surely this is just like a fun little thing with Halloween, right? Surely Niantic will release all of Gen 3 next, right? Surely. Well, in December, they released 50 Pokemon from Gen 3. This marked the beginning of the drip feed era of Pokemon releases. Gen 3 would be mostly completed by February of the next year, just a few months later. By comparison, Gen 4 took forever. The initial wave hit in October of 2018, but it wouldn't finish rolling out until 2019. Gen 5 still had some larger batches of Pokemon that would be released all at once, but after that, Niantic really started to slow the release schedule down. The drip feed turned into drip torture. At this point, Niantic was releasing just 1 or 2 Pokemon at a time. Now, okay, I mean, here's the thing. Niantic probably realized we don't have infinite number of Pokemon, and then they started pooping themselves because they realized their precious cash cow might run out of milk. So the solution was to just stop doing big releases, stretch the Pokedex of each generation out so much that they would match the release pace of the main games. Suffice to say, this has not been popular with the community. For instance, here's a Reddit thread that complained about the drip feed release of Gen 3, which is pretty ironic considering that by today's standards, Gen 3 actually released relatively rapidly. Players, rightfully I think, complained that this sort of release schedule kills hype. Nobody's really excited to wake up and catch one new Pokemon. Still, other players defended the system and said they were sick of people complaining that they had nothing to do. As an aside, people were also upset that Niantic didn't release things chronologically and instead jumped around. By the way, they're still doing this to this day. Do you remember all those pesky driving accidents we talked about earlier? Niantic's solution to the problem of having to look at your phone while playing the game was the Pokemon Go Plus, a Bluetooth Pokeball pin that vibrated, and if you pressed it, would blindly throw a single Pokeball. You wouldn't actually see what it was doing, and it would only ever throw a normal Pokemon with no modifiers, meaning that the catch rate was absurdly low. The hardcore player base loved it because every now and then it would catch them a shiny on their commute home, but for everyone else, it was converting Pokeballs directly into Pidgeys. The battery life was awful, and people even soldered theirs so the button was always pressed. I didn't actually ever own one, but from what I heard, they're pieces of junk and the Bluetooth feature would frequently disconnect. Despite all of this, they were still literally impossible to get a hold of during release. They had a retail price of $35, but reportedly being scalped for upwards of $200 on eBay according to this article. As a result of this, there ended up being a massive third-party market for these things, not only because they were significantly cheaper, but because they also tended to be higher quality and had fewer issues with connecting. The most popular choice being the gacha. In 2018, we got the Pokeball Plus for $50, which was basically the same thing but shaped like a ball. Each one of these also came with a code to unlock Mew in the Let's Go Pikachu in Eevee games, which was, by the way, I think the only way to get Mew in that game officially, at least at the time. When will the day come when they just release a Pokemon game where you can just get every Pokemon? Then in 2023 came the Pokemon Go Plus. Yes, that's actually the real name. To be fair, this one actually fixed some of the issues. It had a rechargeable battery, it had auto catch and auto Pokestop spin, and the Plus Plus would also connect with Pokemon Sleep, a separate app where you could raise a Snorlax by pressing a button before you go to bed. The Plus Plus even had a built-in Pikachu that would sing you lullabies and wake you up in the morning. If you think about it, it means that Niantic trapped a tiny Pikachu inside of the device and forced it to watch you sleep every night. How inhumane, right? If you remember, PvP or player versus player battles was one of the initial things that Niantic had promised to add to the game. PvP was eventually added to the game late in 2018, and like many parts of the game, it wasn't received very well. There were multiple different PvP brackets available. The brackets were Great League and Ultra League for weaker Pokemon, and Master League where anything would go. This is actually kind of a nice system because it meant you could compete even with weaker Pokemon if you wanted to. Unfortunately, creating PvP viable teams is about as complicated as doing a dissertation. Pokemon needed very specific stats to be usable, and if little Timmy showed up using his favorites, he was bound to get obliterated by the competition. Min-maxing is even worse than just having the correct stats, as many meta Pokemon are shadow form Pokemon with exclusive moves that might not even be available anymore or were dependent on RNG. Exclusive moves were moves that were given out during special events like community days, but I'll talk more about those later. Also, good luck trying to build a Master League team with the absurd candy requirement for legendary Pokemon. Ironically, this resulted in Great League being the most popular as it's the easiest to create a team for on the fly. Because of these factors, many players never even gave PvP a chance. The actual gameplay of PvP is very similar to gyms, with the limitations of only getting 3 Pokemon and the bonus of having 3 shields. You can use the shields to block charge moves, and when you perform a charge move, you have to do this stupid mini game where you have to like collect shapes like it's a mid-2000s Nintendo DS game or something. While there was definitely some skill involved with choosing the order of which Pokemon you send out, most people would just copy the most popular competitive strategies they could find online. I'm not really sure this is like Niantic's fault though, this is just what people do with competitive games. In 2022, a poll was run on the Sylph Road subreddit, which asked people why they don't participate in PvP. The most common answer was, I don't want to, and even if Niantic reworked the entire system, I still wouldn't want to. At the end of the day, some players are just going to prefer cooperative gameplay such as raiding, catching shinies, or naming all of their Pokemon after coworkers and then pretending it was a romantic sitcom, like me. PvP for a lot of people just feels sweaty and hostile in a game that they wanted to be cozy and fun. You know what, girl? I get it. I'm here for the cozy, fun gamer vibes too. The next biggest chunk of responses to that poll were that people didn't like the team building mechanics. Several users pointed to one problem in particular: XL candy. XL candy. XL candy. Gosh, you know, I'm sorry, I don't actually even know what XL candy is, because there's no way Niantic would ever add something like XL candy to the game. That's just completely ridiculous. XL candy was introduced in 2020 and allowed Pokemon to go from level 40 to level 50. This is something Niantic created to give players who have literally 10,000 candy for every Pokemon something more to do. Unfortunately for casual players, XL candy is significantly more difficult to collect than normal candy, as you don't get it with every catch. Listen, okay, like XL candy is absurdly grindy. I used to play MapleStory and RuneScape, and XL candy scares me. Naturally, it's also required to make PvP teams competitively viable. Even amongst the hardcore community, there were players accusing each other of being whales or having no life for grinding XL candy. Of course, you could also just choose to run subpar teams on purpose, and this is something that a lot of people do, and honestly, I respect them for it. but eventually you would run into a wall where you wouldn't be able to progress anymore unless you did the grind. Okay, so I'm being really negative. I understand that. And you might be asking yourself, has Niantic ever put out a good update? And actually the answer is yes. In 2018, Niantic would introduce field research and research breakthroughs. Field research is basically like this quest you can get by spinning Pokestops that would give small rewards like berries, balls, or Pokemon encounters. For instance, catch 3 Pokemon of a certain type, evolve a Pokemon, do a raid. It's kind of like if you had homework, but the homework gave you Pokeballs as a reward. What was really interesting was the research breakthroughs. They were a reward for completing field research 7 days in a row. Now, you could skeptically view this as Niantic coming up with a reason that you need to log in for, but it was still a very popular system. On release, I kid you not, okay, Niantic was giving away legendaries for free. From 2018 to 2018, you could get legendary birds, dogs, and even some of the Generation 3 legendaries for free just by doing field research every day. Like I said, everyone in the community absolutely adored this, and some people even said it was one of the main reasons they played the game because they were a rural player and they didn't have access to legendary Pokemon because there weren't any raids around them. So naturally, Niantic heard the player base saying this and they were like, man, we gotta remove that. Instead, you can now get such rare and desirable Pokemon like Volibee, the diaper Pokemon. Thank you, Niantic. We all definitely wanted more of the diaper Pokemon. You know, realistically, Niantic, they just removed it because they hate when people are having fun. Having fun isn't what they made the game for, okay? Be glad you could have the diaper Pokemon, okay? Be glad. They could have given you another Pidgey or Rattata, and they could have charged you a subscription fee to even access the feature. What do you mean having fun for free, huh? What is free? You're free to give Niantic more money, trainer. Okay, let's see those 3 wacky digits on the back, okay? Okay. Okay, so actually what I wanted to say is they removed them because it made them less money. The same month they removed the legendary box, they introduced Giovanni as a replacement as a playable PvP boss you could battle every month. Yes, because a Mafia boss that operates on a calendar schedule makes a lot of sense. And also, that's just 1 legendary a month compared to the 4 that we were getting before. They also added other things like daily incense that encourage players to take a walk and get some free bonus spawns, including the elusive Galarian legendary birds, as well as weekly rewards for hitting certain walking goals. In 2023, routes were added. Routes were predefined user-submitted trails that you could follow and would reward you with various small bonuses. You can think of it as going on a hike, but just walking through a city instead. Why couldn't they have put these on actual hiking trails, huh? As needing to follow a predefined route is kind of antithetical to the core gameplay loop, but I think it's still an alright feature overall. That being said, routes and daily incense weren't things that really got me super excited to play the game either. This was also true of a lot of the other nice features they added, such as Team Rocket balloons, PvP giving a free elite TM, showcases, etc. They just weren't particularly exciting. The Rediscovery update. Oh boy, if you know about this thing, you know we're about to go on a wild ride. The Rediscovery update was something that many players had been asking for years. More ways to customize your avatar. The initial avatar offerings in the game weren't great, and they were kind of giving default Nintendo Me energy. The intention of the update was that your avatar should look more like you, or however you wanted them to look, and I think that's a very good idea overall. In reality, the update was a mess and pretty much nobody liked it. The new avatars were interesting to say the least. They added sliders for various body parameters, which in theory should increase customization, but I don't know what people were expecting, but it certainly wasn't whatever this is. Proportions were bizarre, faces looked uncanny, and the bodies were stiff in a way that creeped people out. Okay, listen, I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about this, but a lot of people were really attached to the way that their avatars looked. Or they simply enjoyed having their character look attractive. Such as this person lamenting the loss of their hips and boobs, or another person mourning how ugly skirts became. Now, easy there, trainer, okay? Niantic's just a humble billion-dollar company. Adding pretty-looking skirts to the game, that's a tall order. Seriously though, I understand that this is kind of a sensitive subject as the original intent was to let people feel represented, which is incredibly important. But I also think that if someone wants to be an anime baddie with physics-defying proportions, that's also totally fine. I mean, my own avatar is female, and she used to be really pretty. Apparently the update was rushed out, which isn't surprising, but it's still shocking to me just how little they cared about the outcome. Oh, and the purchasable outfits in the game were tailored to fit the old avatars, and so glitches or pieces of clothing that looked weird were incredibly common. This was especially awkward because Niantic actually sold sponsored clothing in the game, and many people were upset that they spent real money on stuff that no longer looked the way they wanted it to. I think Niantic thought that this would all just blow over and people would get over it, but a recently released Reddit post by LXPB described, which was written 500 days after the update's release by the way, it described it as one of the most detrimental named updates Niantic had ever released to the game, with most people agreeing with them. The negative reaction to the update was so strong that they started publishing guides on how to actually hide your avatar. The update didn't just uglify everyone's characters though. It also caused game crashes relating to programming errors with the new avatar models. It was such a catastrophe that it attracted attention from outside of the Pogo community. Ultimately, some people hated this update so much that they even quit the game over it. And unfortunately, to this day, the avatars are just as weird and uncomfortable to look at. The Sylph Road was something that every Pogo player was familiar with, especially those that were taking the game a little bit more seriously. It was a grassroots community and research network originating on the Sylph Road subreddit. The Sylph Road more or less existed because of Niantic's total lack of transparency with anything in the game. They collected data on shiny rates, egg hatches, nests, PvP, and raids. They were also responsible for live meetups at community days in certain cities. Basically, they were a cornerstone of the community. Naturally, Niantic heard that people liked the Sylph Road, and so in their infinite wisdom, they were forced to stop financially supporting the Sylph Road website. Niantic wanted to consolidate control over the community and launch their own community ambassador program as a replacement, which involved things like hosting community day over Campfire. Some people speculated that Niantic didn't like that the Sylph Road was releasing rates on stuff, but Niantic also never gave us a straight answer, so we'll never know the real reason behind it. To cap off this section, I'd like you to put on your tinfoil hat with me because we're going to talk about Niantic's ulterior motive. What are Niantic's goals actually for Pokemon Go, okay? Their corporate-friendly mission statement was to get people outside exercising, exploring, and connecting with the community. Very wholesome, okay, but let's be real. The whole point of Pokemon Go wasn't to be a game, it was to be a giant human heat map that Niantic could monetize. This 2019 article goes into details about how Niantic takes frequent snapshots of your location while playing the game. So much so that they are able to determine your route to and from work, daily schedule, and even your crippling Taco Bell addiction. Now, Niantic claims to not sell this data to third parties, but they were more than happy to try and send users to companies. The first sponsored Pokestop existed all the way back in July of 2016. Later, this was expanded to Starbucks, Verizon, AT&T, 7-Eleven, malls, and even airports. Yes, trainer, please go outside and explore the world, especially that Starbucks that's 0.2 miles away from your house. It's a real exotic cultural landmark. Interestingly, sponsored Pokestops were exactly the same as normal ones. They gave no special benefits for spinning, though the sponsored location would often have some sort of in-store tie-in, such as the Pokemon Go Frappuccino. Well, this was all great up until the pandemic hit in 2020. Pokestop and gym interaction was finally doubled, which meant that yours truly could finally paddle the gym outside of his apartment without having to walk outside. Community days were buffed to be 6 hours long, but maybe the best thing they did was introduce remote raids. You could do a raid from anywhere in the world. Rural players rejoiced, and also introverts. But as usual, there wasn't really a great way of organizing remote raids, so the community once again had to step it up by creating third-party apps that would match players together like Pokegenie. Around this same time, Niantic also tested sponsored balloons from Verizon, which were balloons that would fall onto your location in-game and give you rewards. Presumably this had something to do with foot traffic being down, so sponsored Pokestops weren't as useful to companies. That being said, they were literally flying ads in-game. Okay, like I get it. A lot of games have banner ads and maybe we should be thankful that this is all we had to deal with. But this isn't a free-to-play app from some puzzle company you've never heard of. It's literally $1 billion franchise. As pandemic restrictions would ease in 2021, Niantic would announce they were reverting the interaction distance back to normal. This resulted in the biggest backlash the game had ever seen with the hashtag HearUsNiantic movement. The subreddit and Twitter were both a complete mess and featured non-stop meltdowns and complaints. Niantic would ultimately relent and make the increased distance permanent, but it also became clear where their real priorities lay. In 2022, the Community Day buff would be removed, which caused another wave of anger, but this time Niantic didn't back down. In 2023, more changes would be made, this time with remote raids as the target. The remote raid pass would be doubled in price, and bizarrely, players would be capped to 5 remote raids per day. They said that Pokemon Go is ultimately about exploring, and that remote raids were degrading the in-person raid experience that Niantic had so carefully cultivated. Niantic was obviously more interested in gathering data about you than they were in selling you remote raid passes. No doubt they had priced out that your data was more valuable than the remote raid sales were. Every single gacha game company would have killed to sell people 100 remote raid passes a day, but not Niantic. But Niantic didn't just care about mapping out your favorite Taco Bell. That was just phase 1. Remember, okay, they call themselves an augmented reality game company, which was hilarious because I feel like people almost never used AR in the game. It lagged, it drained battery, and outside of influencers taking photos to farm social media, it was totally useless. So Niantic decided, fine, if you're not going to use AR for fun, you're going to use AR for labor. Enter AR mapping tasks. Starting in 2020, you could get quests where the game asked you to scan a Pokestop with your phone's camera. Oftentimes, scanning tasks gave much better rewards than normal Pokestop research tasks such as Poffins. What this meant in practice was awkwardly filming in a 360-degree circle around the Pokestop. In theory, this was to aid in the better AR placement of Pokemon, but really players were just giving Niantic a free 3D map of the world. Players did fight back though. Instead of doing the awkward 360-degree shuffle, they would instead film their feet. Niantic thought they were building an AR cloud dataset, but what they actually got was 400 terabytes of croc photos. Though I'm not really sure if they were actually trying to poison Niantic's dataset or if they just felt too awkward. I mean, personally, I used to go play Pogo in a park near me, and I would get AR scanning tasks for the children's playground. No thanks, Niantic. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. From what I've seen, it seems like the CEO of Niantic, John Hank, was really all in on a future where people would wear glasses that would display a bunch of random information around you, which would seamlessly integrate with your environment, such as a path showing what direction to walk in. I'm not an expert on AR, but my understanding is that it has a lot of the same problems as self-driving cars. It's theoretically possible, but in practice, your phone's camera just isn't enough data to really do anything truly remarkable. I'm sorry, Mr. Hank, but your technology's best use case is people taking random photos of Eevee in public restrooms. The motto of Pokemon is very simply, catch 'em all. And at its most basic, Pogo is a game centered around collecting. Even in the mainline games, some Pokemon are more elusive, such as legendaries or even version exclusives. Of course, version exclusives, trade evolutions, and other things were scummy tactics to force kids to buy more than one cartridge. The point is, Niantic needed its trade evos. It needed something to make Pokemon more than just available. Regional Pokemon were present from the very beginning of the game, with the first one being Tauros in North America, Mr. Mime in Europe, and Kangaskhan in Australia. Since then, a huge number of new regionals has been added in the game, such as Hawlucha being exclusive to Mexico, Klefki being exclusive to France, Sigilif to Egypt. You get the idea. The list is extensive, by the way. Basically, it became extremely impossible to obtain these Pokemon without traveling. Let's be real, unless your job is literally to play Pokemon Go, you're not traveling to Europe just to catch Sigilif. Of course, Niantic knows this and used global access to regionals as a way to sell event tickets. For instance, GoFest 2021 gave access to Chatot, Sock, and Luditone. These events were huge for fear of missing out, aka FOMO. When else would you be able to get these Pokemon if you weren't traveling all the time? Technically, you could trade people for these Pokemon, but trading had to be done in person. And probably you don't know very many people that have been to Egypt specifically to catch Sigilif. Well, speaking of people that love traveling, some people loved collecting rare Pokemon so much that they actually did specifically plan vacations around catching regionals. In 2024, the Wall Street Journal actually interviewed some of these people. One couple planned their honeymoon around events and regional Pokemon like Furfrou variants. Another couple caught a perfect Simisear on Mount Everest. Clearly the real prize here was the Simisear, right? A theme with these interviews is that these trainers really don't appreciate people spoofing for regionals. One of them even compared spoofing to doping as an athlete. And while I don't personally condone spoofing, I feel like that's a crazy comparison. I'm also not sure how I feel about referring to normally caught Pokemon that aren't spoofed as free range. One system I've failed to talk about yet in this video is the presence of individual values, or IVs. This is something I bet Niantic barely even thought about when they made the game, but players became completely obsessed with these things. IVs are randomly decided for every Pokemon and are added to the base attack, defense, and hit points values of that Pokemon. This meant that in a way, every Pokemon was different, unless they had the same IVs. Players would naturally become fascinated by 100% or hundo Pokemon, just like that Simisear that was caught on Mount Everest. Interestingly, IVs don't actually matter very much, as the difference between a nundo and a hundo might only be 10 to 15%. And the only stat that really mattered, at least for rating, was the attack stat. But it still gave elite players an excuse to grind hundreds of the same Pokemon looking for perfection. Something that was very intentional by Niantic was the introduction of shiny Pokemon. Shiny Pokemon were first released in March of 2017 and are literally just a palette swap. In gacha games, you might roll for a cosmetic where your favorite waifu gets to wear a bikini, or if you're a Tamagotchi player, you'd roll for a pregnant version of Cinnamoroll. But in Pokemon, you roll for a slightly different shade of yellow Pikachu that colorblind players can't even tell the difference between. Of course, even mainline game players are obsessed with shinies. Who could forget the legendary Shiny Ponyta moment?
Oh my god! I can't believe it! Take a look at this, everybody! A live Shiny Ponyta!
You know, I have to admit, Shiny Ponyta, really good shiny. Really good shiny. The base odds for finding a wild Pokemon in Pokemon Go as a shiny version of itself is 1 in 512. Shundos, or shiny hundos, were only a 1 in 4,000 chance. Don't forget, you haven't actually completed the Pokedex until you get Shenundos and Shahundos in both genders. Similar to the release schedule of Pokemon, shinies were also drip fed. In a way, this was actually kind of good because it meant that early on in the life cycle of the game, it was actually possible to get almost every shiny if you were playing constantly. Later on, if you would miss an event or a community day, you were basically screwed. Now, Niantic looked at regional and shinies and said, you know, these are really good, but the problem is that technically they're available all the time. We need something that drives FOMO. Thus, costumed Pokemon were born. The first was Santa Hat Pikachu and Raichu during Christmas of 2016, though it wouldn't be until 2020 that Niantic would really start pumping these babies out. I actually used to really like and collect costume Pokemon, but these days there are so many that it just feels overwhelming. Many players now consider it slop content that's only purpose to fill up your Pokemon bag and make you spend more money. Okay, so here's the thing, okay? Like, I love costume Pokemon. I think they are so cute. I do have a soul, okay? I just want you guys to know that. But I also agree with the general community's sentiment that it would have been better if the costumes were something you could apply to any Pokemon rather than just one. I understand that this would be like way too much work and is probably like completely infeasible, but that would have been the dream. The real thing that drove me nuts with costume Pokemon is that they can also be shiny, such as Shiny Glaceon with a cape, which I happen to have right here. I haven't been able to find it, but I remember a Reddit comment about Shiny Glaceon with a cape, and this guy was suffering from the worst FOMO I'd ever seen. He said something like, guys, we don't know when Shiny Glaceon with a cape will be back, if ever. I mean, he's right. Did it come back? I don't know if it did, but I've got it. Niantic would continue to try and add more unique Pokemon to the game, such as when they introduced tiny/large Pokemon. Honestly, who cares about this? I can't think of a single person as excited when they find a tiny or a large Pokemon. Showcases were introduced in 2023 and are events that occur at Pokestops for set periods of time. You can enter a Pokemon into a showcase to compete against other Pokemon for who has the biggest/heaviest Pokemon. So I guess only large Pokemon are useful. You know what? Short Kings, rise up, okay? Rise up against this injustice. There were some decent rewards for participating in showcases, but nothing special. The update received a lot of criticism for being yet another feature that encourages you to buy increased Pokemon storage so you can hoard your chonkiest chonkers to submit to showcases. In the mainline Pokemon games, eggs are something that you get from Pokemon Daycare after putting 2 of your Pokemon in. Don't worry, I'm sure it's consensual. Probably. After a certain number of steps taken, the egg will hatch. which is extremely convenient as that translates perfectly into Pokemon Go. I'm sure Niantic was thrilled that they didn't have to come up with their own mechanic for eggs and can just rip it wholesale from the mainline games. You get eggs from Pokestops at random, but you're only allowed to hold a certain number of them at a time. Pogo doesn't let you walk all of your eggs at the same time. No, no, no. I'm sorry, did you think you could have a fun game mechanic that incentivizes walking around outside for free? Instead, you're given one free permanent egg incubator that lets you incubate a grand total of 1 egg at a time. Seeing as your inventory is full of all these other eggs though, man, sure does feel like a waste. Imagine if you could be walking all those puppies at the same time. Well, that's why they let you purchase additional incubators. I was an idiot when I first started playing this game, and I thought that the additional incubators were permanent. So just let that sink in. If you ever felt stupid, you weren't that stupid. Each purchased incubator is only good for 3 uses, which means if you plan to hatch a lot of eggs in a short period of time, you're going to be going through a lot of incubators. In case you wanted to grind them even faster, Niantic would introduce the Super Incubator in 2017, which would hatch eggs slightly faster for a cost. Players did find some pretty bizarre workarounds to needing to actually walk eggs. This was by creating egg walking contraptions that would gyrate or swing or otherwise move their phone around for them while they were doing something else. These ranged from surprisingly sophisticated to hatching eggs, a controlled study using a Roomba, or the surprising multitude of people that would simply strap their phone to their dog and let their dog go crazy somewhere. These contraptions were actually so popular that third-party companies started producing them for purchase. 2024 Pokemon Go Auto Walker You Shouldn't Miss isn't a title I ever thought I would see, but there it is. It's absolutely giving smartphone baby cradle vibes, and I hate it. So what's the point of hatching eggs at all? I think this is a question Niantic probably asked themselves too. How can we encourage more people to give us their hard-earned cash so they can obsessively walk around pixel eggs? Ah, I've got it. Shinies! As far as I know, certain baby Pokemon have only ever been available from eggs. For instance, Riolu's shiny chance is somewhere around 1 in 60. And actually, I should clarify here that Pokemon shiny odds are Pokemon specific. For instance, a Geodude caught in the wild or hatched from an egg or caught from a raid will always have a shiny chance of 1 in 500. Riolu is a perma-boosted shiny odds Pokemon. This is a weird way of saying that it has an incredibly low availability and is difficult to find. While 1 in 60 might not sound that bad, you have to remember that Riolu is a rare hatch, so you would need to hatch way more than 60 eggs to get a shiny Riolu. Niantic sometimes tosses people a bone and runs events that have boosted egg hatching rates, as they did with Riolu Hatch Day, but it's also questionable if this is actually for the benefit of the player. After all, most people probably consider getting a shiny Riolu completely impossible, so if you make it seem like it's actually obtainable, people will happily open their wallets. Eggs also have built-in FOMO. They're on a schedule, so the things that you can get out of an egg are constantly changing. So if something good is in the egg, we definitely have to buy incubators, right? Oh, and also, there's costumed egg Pokemon, and they can also be shiny, because of course they can. They're limited, guys. Guys, they're limited. We have to buy incubators, okay? There's no other option here, okay? The long-promised raid feature finally dropped in July 2017, just in time for players to remember that Mewtwo was still stuck in the trailer and not in the game. Being able to challenge a powerful boss Pokemon such as Mewtwo with a group of other trainers would feel like a natural in-game for players to participate in. The only problem with this is that it requires you to actually have friends. It also finally added a use for leveling Pokemon for players that didn't like gyms, as well as community participation, as players would have to coordinate to take down the powerful Pokemon together. At least, that's what was supposed to happen. The way raids worked on release was an egg would appear over gyms with a timer counting down. Once the timer finished, a raid boss would spawn at that gym and would be available to battle for a set period of time. There were originally 5 tiers of raids, with each one being more difficult than the last. This would later be reduced to 3 egg tiers because of redundancy, and also because very few players did level 2 and level 3 raids. No one was really very excited about paying money to catch 1 Electabuzz. But wait, Zach, how do we actually do a raid? You ask with your big sparkling eyes and total lack of trauma. Well, you need a raid pass. Because of course you do. And it costs money, by the way. See, Niantic wasn't going to let you do as many raids as you wanted to, at least not for free. So along with the release of raids, they released raid passes, a premium item that costs Pokecoins to obtain. Depending on available shop bundles, raid passes could cost anywhere from around 60 to 70 US cents. Okay, admittedly, you can get one free raid pass a day by spinning a gym. Okay, so there was that. But if you wanted to do a large number of raids, it was definitely going to be necessary to buy passes, and believe me, they did a fantastic job of incentivizing you to do a bunch of raids. How did they get us to do raids again? What's the theme here? Oh, shinies, right, shiny Pokemon, okay. So for legendary Pokemon, the odds were actually increased to 1 in 20. Usually Niantic would initially release a raid Pokemon in not shiny form, and then later re-release it with a shiny. This would quite brilliantly maximize the number of raids that trainers would need to do, and it kind of created two hype windows, the first one being for the release of the Pokemon and then the release of the shiny. Another thing is Niantic often didn't disclose the shiny odds for non-legendaries. While the community was able to determine the shiny rate based on reports, it's not always been consistent between raid Pokemon. And the odds were sometimes really bad, I'm talking like 1 in 70 or worse. Meaning that players would be chasing after shinies in raids that they realistically had no chance of getting. Isn't it sad how little transparency Niantic had? Now, once you had your handy dandy raid pass, all you had to do was go to the gym and then queue to fight the raid boss. This would put you into a lobby where other players would have a limited amount of time to join, with a maximum of 20 players per raid lobby. Once the raid started, it essentially functioned the same as a gym, except with a 3-minute time limit. You would get to pick a party of 6 Pokemon, and then you would just rapidly tap the screen to have your Pokemon attack until the boss fainted. There were fairly significant problems with this system. The first was in how exactly are players supposed to coordinate to meet at a gym? Because at any given time, there were quite a few raids happening. Occasionally, you would stumble upon a group of people that were doing a raid, but it was pretty common to show up to a raid and be the only person there. This meant that almost always it was necessary to have some level of real-life coordination. The early solution to this were using messaging services like Slack, Telegram, WhatsApp, and Discord, where players could agree to meet at a certain time. This meant planning part of your day to drive to PetSmart to fight Kyogre with a bunch of strangers. Actually, an experience I recommend. It wasn't as easy as just finding people to play with though. The legendary Pokemon were quite difficult, and some of them, especially the chonkers with high defense and HP, were very difficult to beat within the timer, especially if you only had a few players. This was compounded by the game's absurd Pokemon recommendation system to use in battles. Oftentimes the game would recommend tanky Pokemon like Blissey that did almost no damage, but because raids are on a timer, damage is the most important thing for a Pokemon to do. Most casual players wouldn't bother changing their recommended Pokemon, and this drastically increased the chance of a raid failing. So imagine this. You just got off work and you see someone posted a Lugia raid in Slack. So you've decided to skip going to the grocery store like a responsible adult and instead go raid Lugia. On Slack, 7 people agreed to show up to the raid, and you guys felt pretty confident that you could beat it. You show up at the raid, and there's only 3 other people there. Well, no problem, right? You guys can still definitely beat it. I mean, come on. You queue up to fight the boss, and next to your super effective attacker, 3 Blisseys pop up. You failed to beat the raid boss, and demotivated, the other 3 players decide to leave. Or you decide to wait for another player that's definitely going to be there in the next 10 minutes. For sure, guys, don't worry. Congratulations, you just wasted 40 minutes of your day, and you lost your free raid pass, because of course, you don't get it back if you lose the raid. I can speak about this so clearly because I lived this. Many times, actually. And if you never had an experience like this, congratulations. You probably had friends that were into the game just as much as you were. I wanted to emphasize that this system was really only broken if you didn't have a group of friends to play with, which yes, it was me. Over the years, Niantic would eventually improve the recommendation system to prioritize damage more, which helped a lot. After you defeated the boss, you would get Premier Balls, and once you ran out, the raid boss would flee and you would lose your chance of catching it. Raids also gave golden raspberries, which massively boost the chance to catch a Pokemon. A lot of the community absolutely loathed the system because it meant you could go through all the effort of driving to a raid, spending money on a raid pass, coordinating with community people to fight it, and then after all of that effort, it flees, and you don't get it. If you didn't have a lot of free time or there were only a couple gyms nearby you, it was possible to miss the entire release window of a legendary Pokemon which originally was usually around 2 weeks. There were other incentives besides just catching the legendary Pokemon though. For instance, raids could give rare candies, a resource that could be turned into any type of candy in the game. This was really useful for evolving rare Pokemon, but it was also one of the best ways of powering up your legendaries, as catching one would still only give the standard 3 candy. To address the problems of raid coordination, Niantic would, in June of 2023, release Niantic Campfire, a standalone app from the Pokemon Go app that could be used to coordinate raids. It's a nice addition, but a lot of players felt that it should have come out a lot sooner. And many also rightfully complained that it felt half-baked. Not to mention, but why is this a standalone app? Why isn't it just in Pokemon Go? I don't get it. Surely it would have made more sense to just directly add this into the game. Campfire, of course, had all of the usual problems you get with any social feature in games. People trying to flirt, acting like it's a dating app, harassing each other, threatening each other. How much of that is actually Niantic's fault? I don't know. Some people felt that Niantic should have had better moderation, but at the end of the day, I think that people are always just going to be nasty to each other no matter what you try and do. Some of the worst examples of behavior that I could find was A, people being sexually harassed or creeped on. There was a shocking amount of this. Maybe the funniest was someone being added to a Pokemon Go swingers group in Campfire, which I'm really glad to know that exists. One feature that especially concerned people were flares. Flares were a signal you could drop to tell other players to meet you at a specific spot. On paper, it was supposed to make coordination easier. In practice, a lot of players felt like it was an invitation for trouble. For instance, there were claims that people would use flares to set up robberies, but I was never able to find any actual evidence of this. However, we still have a lot of other raids to talk about. This might surprise you, but the first legendary raid boss in Pokemon Go was not Mewtwo. Mewtwo was eventually released with the introduction of EX raids, which were a confusing separate raid system. EX raids were invite only, and you could only obtain an invitation by completing a normal raid at an EX gym. Only certain gyms were counted as EX gyms, which the community would document, but it was never really 100% clear how the invitation system actually worked. As someone that did a handful of EX raids, I can tell you the experience was incredibly strange. It's kind of like going to a dentist appointment, but instead of a dentist appointment, you go to a random location with a bunch of strangers to fight a fictional monster. EX raids quietly disappeared during the pandemic, and honestly, I don't think the system was particularly popular with anyone because it often conflicted with working hours. Raids would continue to evolve over the years though. If you're familiar with the mainline games, you'll know that starting with the 6th generation of Pokemon, each successive game was given a new gimmick. In Sun and Moon, this was Z moves, in X and Y, it was Mega Evolutions, in Sword and Shield, it was Dynamax and Gigantamax, and then the newest iteration in Scarlet Violet was Terrestrialization. Which I might add, personally, this is the most squonktastic in my opinion. Look, okay, like the point of this video isn't for me to just poop all over the mainline games, although I would love to do that, okay? You know me, I would love to do that. But the point is to discuss how these gimmicks were implemented into Pokemon Go, which can only be described as catastrophically. Mega Evolution was added to Pogo in 2020, and the initial Mega Evolvable Pokemon were the Kanto starters, because of course it was. And also Beedrill for some unholy reason. Mega Evolution sounds really appealing on paper. It's a serious power boost to the Pokemon itself, and it also boosts all the other Pokemon in the raid. This all sounds great, right? Well, there's a catch. There's always a catch with Niantic, isn't there? In order to Mega Evolve a Pokemon, you need to get Mega Energy for that Pokemon. You can only obtain Mega Energy by doing Mega Raids. And it's a consumable currency as Mega Evolutions initially only lasted for 4 hours at a time. This meant that by using Mega Evolved Pokemon, you would need to constantly do Mega Raids for that Pokemon to make sure that you had enough Mega Energy to even use the Pokemon in the first place. The system also put a lot of pressure for players to use their Mega Evolution a lot after they activated it. This meant we're buying raid passes, people. Okay, come on, guys. I just Mega Evolved. We need to do like 20 raids. Okay, I'm not wasting this. All right. Despite being a highly anticipated update to the game, there was major backlash to this one. Most casual players just chose to straight up ignore it. A now deleted Reddit post by user Numeral Joker was heavily critical of the update, and it received over 10,000 upvotes. They explained in detail how unlocking a Pokedex entry for any of the Kanto starters Mega Evolution would require using up to 30 raid passes, which isn't exactly a small amount of money to spend. But it gets worse, okay? Since Mega Raids were now put into the raid rotation, that meant that you had no idea when any given Mega Evolution would be available to raid. Obviously, this was an attempt to generate FOMO. Guys, we don't know when Mega Charizard's gonna be available again. We gotta stock up on Mega Energy right now. This is one of the first times that I personally didn't really interact with a feature in the game, and to this day, I've never Mega Evolved a single Pokemon. Niantic did eventually take notice that people hated it, and so some changes were made in the following months to make Mega Evolutions a little bit more user-friendly, such as increasing the duration from 4 hours to 8 hours, increasing the amount of Mega Energy each raid gave, and reducing the initial Mega Energy cost. A later update would also make it so that you could now walk Pokemon for some token amount of Mega Energy if you were willing to put them into your buddy slot. Eventually, they actually did kind of fix Megas by making it so instead of needing to use Mega Energy every time you wanted to evolve it, after the initial attempt, the Pokemon would just go into hibernation for a while, and you could skip that by using more Mega Energy. Since the Mega system was so confusing and mildly useless, Niantic of course had the brilliant idea to hamfist another even more confusing and useless system into the game. Dynamax, aka Dynaturds as I like to call them. Dynamax was already not very popular. It was introduced in the Sword and Shield mainline games and was essentially just Mega Evolution, but the Pokemon goes big mode and any Pokemon can do it. Obviously, implementing Dynamax Pokemon into raids directly wouldn't work. They would just fulfill the same niche as a Mega Pokemon as a big strong body on your team. So how did Niantic solve this? I wonder, you ask? Well, they decided to make a completely separate raid mode called Max Battles. Wow, thank you Niantic. Thank you so much. This is exactly what I needed in my life. I needed Max Battles. Thank you. In order to interact with Dynamax raids, you need to collect Max Particles. Particles are used to do Dynamax raids as well as level up Dynamax Pokemon. And because Niantic is Niantic, of course they put a cap on the number of Max Particles you could have at any time because why wouldn't they? You do Dynamax raids at power spots, which are visually very similar to Pokestops or gyms. However, power spots aren't user submitted and were instead created by Niantic's internal data. According to a community post from Niantic Labs, this internal data came from a combination of, and I quote, unused user-created way spots from Niantic's Lightship platform that were previously unused, and data from the Overture Maps Foundation, though it doesn't really matter. The point is, a lot of these power spot locations Niantic created were really bad. There were reports on Reddit and Twitter of power spots that were of locations that no longer existed, including places that shut down 6 years before the update even went live. And there were also major issues with many of the power spots being duplicates of existing places of interest. As far as how the actual max battle system would play out, I actually have to hand it to Niantic here, as the system was both much better and much worse than the original raid system. First off, it keeps more or less the same star system as the original raids, where you have 1, 3, and 5-star raids, and then as an added difficulty level, you also have Gigantamax raids. Each raid level costs progressively more max points as an entry fee. Though at the very least you do get your max points back if you fail the raid, so that is an improvement. Additionally, Gigantamax battles can have up to a whopping 40 players to join in. That's a lot of awkward strangers standing next to each other tapping on their phones. If you don't know what the difference between a Dynamax Pokemon and a Gigantamax Pokemon is, well, I didn't know either, okay? Gigantamax is like if there were Mega Pokemon, where they would get glitter ribbons in their hair and a fun tail or something. It's exactly the same system as Megas, just needlessly complicated. So you would end up with the super special glittery Pokemon, and then the go enjoy hanging out in the corner with Volibee, the diaper Pokemon. That being said, the battle system was legitimately better. It added much needed complexity that was missing from the normal raids. There are 3 types of moves you can teach your Dynamax Pokemon. These are attacking moves, healing moves, and a move that reduces the amount of damage the raid boss deals. As I mentioned before, the way most players had been playing raid battles was to obliterate their phone screen by tapping as fast as possible because their brain had liquefied from all the money they gave to Niantic. So naturally, most players just spammed attacking moves because that's all they knew. This led to maxed out parties of 40 players failing Gigantamax raids and lots of frustration. Like with normal raids, many players would simply give up and choose to leave. Then you would end up with less players and the raid would get harder and you would be guaranteed to fail again. Many players question what the point of Dynamax raids even was outside of getting a Pokédex entry. The community sentiment can be summed up by this one Reddit post which depicted an edited image of Dynamax as Dyna sucks. Players joked that it was so different from Mega Raids. And one of the biggest community criticisms, like I already mentioned, was that it's a separate system from the current raid system and they don't really interact very well. You can't Dynavolve your Dyna Pokemon in normal raids, and you can't use your leveled up attackers in Dyna raids. This led many players to feeling unrewarded or unincentivized to participate in Dynamax raids at all. There have been a couple updates to Dynamax raids, some good and some bad. The best thing to happen is that you can now get max particles every day for free, which is very nice. The bad was that they added a new type of cash item called a Max Mushroom that boosts the power of your Dynamax Pokemon. Really, Niantic? You know, I shouldn't need to explain this, but buying power boosts is like freemium mobile crap tier. It makes the game feel pay to win, it caters to whales, and this is exactly the sort of thing that kills player bases. Of course, it's Pokemon, so it's like impossible to kill the player base though. And then there's Eternatus, who just came out recently actually. As part of the max finale for PogoFest 2025, you could battle Eternamax Eternatus. Wow, that is a mouthful. Eternatus took significantly more candy than normal to max out, but luckily Niantic added a helpful feature that lets you pay 200 Pokecoins to double raid rewards, which was added in 2024. This is such a scam, like I legitimately can't emphasize enough how bad this is. Maxing out one Eternatus apparently would cost anywhere from $200 to $400 depending on if you did in-person raids or remote raids, and it seemed like most players settled for just not leveling up their Eternatus. The original level cap at the start of Pokemon Go was level 40, and in 2020 this was raised to level 50. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for the hardcore players, getting to level 50 was significantly more difficult than reaching level 40. See, originally the only thing that mattered when leveling up was reaching experience milestones. You could earn experience through catching Pokemon, evolving Pokemon, or earn a lot of experience by doing raids. The XP gain from raids was so high that many of the original hardcore players of the game referred to players that reached level 40 after raids as raid babies. Level 50 was an entirely different beast though, as you could no longer simply hit experience milestones. You also needed to do tasks. I won't go over every single task, but some of the more time-consuming ones would probably be defeating 50 Team Rocket leaders to reach level 45, getting 35 platinum medals for level 49, and achieving rank 10 in PvP for level 50. Medals, by the way, are in-game achievements that are displayed on trainer profile pages, aka the place that literally no one is ever going to look. Medals existed for things such as eggs hatched, miles walked, Pokemon caught, etc, etc. They mostly offered no real benefit besides the type caught medals, which give a boost to the catch percentage for those particular types. It's possible to play for thousands of hours and never hit 35 platinum medals. I know because I'm not even close. Many of them are extremely time consuming to get or require you to play daily for like 350 days in a row, so that's fun. Essentially, hitting level 50 is not for the faint of heart, and it's an achievement that most Pogo players will probably never reach. Some players have joked that if you hit level 50, you're ready to start a chunk-locked Ultimate Iron Man in RuneScape, or start trying to grind XL Candy. I'm not sure which is worse. The reason that Niantic made level 50 so difficult to get was to satiate their hardcore players who are also their biggest spenders. You can't beat the game, guys. You have to grind forever, okay? You have to keep giving us money forever. After I recorded this video, they actually announced that they're raising the level cap to level 80. So that's fun. Okay, you know, is it just me, or is all of this getting really exhausting? In the beginning of the game, it was relatively easy to get every Pokemon, but it got harder and harder over time. Early on, many players would maintain what was called a living dex. A living dex, or a living Pokédex, is to have all Pokemon fully collected in your Pokemon storage. Originally, these only included evolutionary stages as well as one of each gender if you wanted to get really spicy. And on the release of the game, this wasn't actually that difficult to do. But eventually this would be expanded to include shinies, costumes for each gender, shiny costumes, hundos, nundos, Shundos, Shenundos, Luckies, Shadows, Shiny Shadows, Purified, Shiny Purified, Legendaries, Mythicals, Megas, Dynaturds, Regionals, and of course Pokemon with event exclusive backgrounds which you might not even know about. And let's not forget about the big and small Pokemon, even though I wish I could. Sure, you don't actually have to collect everything, and some players were really good about setting a boundary where they would only have one copy of each Pokemon. This is something that was actually kind of necessary because Pokemon storage in the game wasn't free. You had to buy it. As a result of this, a lot of players just gave up on collecting a living dex. You remember the motto of Pokemon? You remember what we talked about at the beginning of this section? Gotta catch 'em all. Well, in Pogo, it is not possible to catch 'em all unless we're willing to be illegal. So there is a black market for Pokemon, especially on eBay. You can purchase an account that has a Pokemon you want on it and then later trade it to yourself. The people selling these accounts are most likely using spoofing bot farms in order to obtain them. I'm not really sure how I feel about this, but it definitely feels pretty bad. Almost a year after the launch of the game, Niantic would announce something ambitious, something exciting. Pokemon Go Fest 2017. It would also be the debut of the legendary Pokemon, with Lugia to be the first one ever available. Almost as soon as the event was announced, it sold out, with tickets going for $20 a piece. Unfortunately, it was quickly discovered that scalpers were flipping tickets on eBay and StubHub for up to $300 each. Scalpers and Pokemon. Who would have guessed? This would be the first bad omen that this event was simply just not meant to be. The event would take place on July 22nd, 2017, with people flying from all over the United States and even the world to hunt rare exclusive Pokemon such as Heracross, Unknown, and of course Lugia. Players woke up early that Saturday morning and packed the 4 Pokemon Go essentials: water, snacks, sunscreen, and a giant portable battery the same size as a car. That's when they would be greeted by this. An absolutely massive line. No worries, of course. It's natural that a big event like this would have a long line. 3 hours! People had to wait in this line for 3 hours just to get into the park. However, this is when things would go from bad to worse. Players were completely unable to log into the game if they were with Verizon or AT&T due to the cell data network overloading. Niantic's lack of foresight meant that they hadn't talked to cell providers beforehand, and instead only contacted them once problems had occurred mid-event. Incredible, bold, innovative. This is true girl boss behavior and I applaud them. Niantic's staff were reportedly in a panic, and it all came to a boiling point during the opening ceremony when the Niantic CEO took the stage. Players began chanting, "We can't play," and "Fix the game" to cut off the stage hosts.
Welcome to the stage, the CEO of Niantic, Mr. John Hanke.
Not even announcing the surprise release of Articuno for later that day was enough to quell the players' anger. At 2 p.m, Niantic would expand the event spawns to a 2-mile radius around the park to try and calm tempers. Great idea, except the line to get out of the park was almost as long as the line to get in. Unfortunately for Niantic, they had also decided to invite dozens upon dozens of influencers to the event. And not just Pokemon Go creators either, which meant there were a lot of very awkward videos published about the event where people just weren't playing the game. It was kind of like a sponsored funeral. Credit is due where credit is due, as Niantic did eventually refund people's tickets and give attendees $100 in in-app credit. For people that lived in Chicago, this was actually a pretty sweet deal. But for people who traveled across the country or from Europe, this wouldn't even get close to touching the costs. One player by the name of Jonathan Norton, who flew from California to Chicago, was so mad at Niantic's colossal screw-up that he actually filed a class action lawsuit against the company to compensate for travel expenses, though the lawsuit was explicitly for false advertising and failure to deliver on promised experience. It took 2 years, but surprisingly, he was successful in winning $1.6 million for everyone that attended. This only really converted into about $100 per person if you bothered to submit a report. The 2017 disaster didn't stop Niantic from trying again in 2018 though. And admittedly, this one went a lot smoother. It was hosted at Lincoln Park in Chicago, still capped at 20,000 attendance, though this time they had Celebi, the celery Pokemon, debuting. Notably, this event had themed biomes with physical sets that Niantic actually built, and generally speaking, this one was considered a massive success. Okay, besides the scalpers still being a huge problem, but come on, we gotta give them props for something, right? In 2019, GoFest went global with 3 separate events in Chicago, Dortmund, and Yokohama, this time with a whopping 300,000 total attendees and early access to Jirachi, the Wish Pokemon. I wish that I could have gone to some of these events. They brought back the habitats and they sounded pretty crazy. Germany had the mysterious woods and Japan had cloudy sky. They kind of sound like levels out of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, actually. Worldwide players were able to participate via the Global Challenge, which gave benefits to all players. Unfortunately, there were overcrowding issues in Dortmund, and players complained about the in-app lottery system Niantic had developed to prevent scalping. Well, we all know what happened in 2020, and it was the first GoFest where anyone could participate, and it took place all over the world. Tickets cost $15, and the day was broken into rotating biomes. Unfortunately, a lot of people criticized that this was basically just a $15 community day, and in the years since, players have increasingly complained that the events felt worse quality and Niantic was devaluing the tickets. When they did return to in-person events again, people also complained that those were also worse. The most recent GoFest in 2025 was generally panned, with players complaining about low shiny rates and lackluster spawns. The 2025 in-person event wasn't all bad though. It featured the wedding of Sandra and Les, who had previously met 4 years ago to trade a Corsola and had gotten engaged at a previous GoFest. When Niantic heard about this, they offered to fly them out to get married at GoFest. Pikachu attended the ceremony, Squirtle and Chansey were the cake toppers, and the Pokemon theme song played as they walked down the aisle. Okay, like, I get it, you know, this sounds like peak corporatized cringe. Kind of like how people side-eye those Disney weddings at Cinderella Castle. But I can't lie, okay? This one's actually pretty good. Sometimes cringe is good, okay? Now, while we're on the subject of romance, I wanted to talk to you guys about some of the ways that companies would try and exploit lonely Pokemon Go trainers. For instance, in 2016, there was a singles mixer for Pogo players in Tokyo at Hibiya Park. It was organized by a Japanese company and not Niantic. It cost around $30 for men and $15 for women to attend. Apparently they'd planned a whole bunch of these, but I couldn't find any information about any of them except for the first one. This leads me to believe it was a colossal failure, but it's pretty funny to think about people awkwardly shuffling around a park, trying to catch a Lapras and also trying to find a girlfriend. And somehow this idea didn't die off. In early 2025, there was this I Choose You mixer in Fremont, California. Unfortunately, I get the impression that these events are less about catching feelings and more about the company catching your credit card details. In a similar vein, there was one company that launched Poke Dates, which was supposed to be Pogo Tinder. Spoiler alert, it didn't last past 2020. Apparently it worked by having users answer a questionnaire about what sort of partner they wanted, and then they were matched together by another human being. Your first date was free, but subsequent dates would cost $20. Okay, so supposedly this was a legitimate service, but I couldn't find any evidence of anyone ever actually using it. And I get the feeling that probably you would be matching with bots or something, which is very common in these scam-specific dating sites. Now, if Pokemon Go ever had a second golden age after the first summer, it was definitely the introduction of Community Days. Community Day was a 3-hour event where spawns of certain Pokemon would be boosted, and that Pokemon could learn a special move just on that day. The first one featured Surf Pikachu in January of 2018. But for many players, the real draw of Community Day was that the shiny odds for Pokemon would be boosted to 1 in 25, which is a massive increase. Many of the early Pokemon featured in Community Day were also rare to find in the wild, like Larvitar, Dratini, and Beldum, which also made them more exciting. For a while, Community Day felt like launch summer in miniature. Entire parks, campuses, and towns were suddenly full of people staring at their phones trying to click a pink Dratini. Cities even had official meetups, and for the first time in years, you could look another human being in the eyes without pretending to be lost. It wasn't without its problems though. For one, it was only a 3-hour window. So if you were working, you were shit out of luck. There were a lot of complaints about it being unfair for players that couldn't participate, especially when Niantic started handing out meta-defining moves for raids or PvP that were only available during Community Day, assuming you cared about that. As much as everyone loved the initial Community Days, the magic definitely faded over time. Niantic started to repeat Pokemon or started introducing choices that weren't particularly exciting. I mean, I get it, you know, there's only so many cool Pokemon available. I can personally attest to seeing fewer people engaging in community days as the years went on, and it's something that makes me really sad to think about. I had a lot of community days that I'll never forget, but at least we were all able to make beautiful memories together. While events like Community Day and Pogo Fest definitely defined an era for Niantic, the other events they did were a lot less memorable. Niantic flooded the calendar with themed mini events such as Valentine's Day, Adventure Week, Halloween, Earth Day, you name it, they had it. They all followed the same exact formula: boosted Stardust, boosted candy, boosted spawns of certain types. Maybe shiny odds were better for a couple Pokemon if you were lucky. They were fun in the moment, but they definitely started to blur together over time, and some players even complained that they missed the normal part of the game because events were basically running non-stop. At long last, we've reached what many players would probably describe as the core issue with Pokemon Go: the monetization. So far, we've discussed the monetization of eggs and how Niantic has locked shinies behind eggs to encourage people to do them. We talked about the monetization of raids and max battles, and many people in the community argued that these systems were badly damaged by the fact that they were monetized. And I have no doubt that many features in the game would be far more satisfying and fun if you didn't have to pay to engage with them. On the other hand, players rightly pointed out that it's possible to earn premium currency for free by putting your Pokemon into gyms, or that Niantic gives you a free raid pass every day, or that we have a free incubator at all. And while all of those things are true, I still think it's really difficult to play Pokemon Go to its fullest without spending money. Taking a look at the cash shop in Pogo, and it's immediately apparent that there are things in here that should never be sold for real money. Pokeballs, potions, and revives are such basic parts of the game that you should just have an unlimited supply of them. And yet somehow I am guilty of buying Pokeballs. Yes, I'm that guy. Then there's the bag and storage space. I've hinted at this already, but Pokemon is a game about collecting things, so needing to pay for bag space feels borderline pay to play. I mention this because many players actually defend Niantic selling bag and storage space, because the billion-dollar company really needs a new way to make money, right? If they needed to make money, selling trainer outfits feels a lot less exploitative to me, because it's not something that impacts gameplay. Another example of this is the ability to switch your team. Originally on release, there was no way, but it was eventually added for the small price of $10. I get it, you know, $10 isn't a lot, but it feels pretty absurd for something like this. At least when you buy an outfit, you know some poor 3D artist had to create it. With this, it's just flipping a single entry in the code of the game and for far more money than most of the outfits cost. Then there are the more expected cash items such as lucky eggs, which offer a temporary experience boost, stardust boosters, and lures, which will attract Pokemon by causing them to spawn every couple of minutes. If lures were just that, I don't think anyone would actually complain about them, but certain Pokemon can only evolve with the presence of a lure. For example, Leafeon needs a mossy lure and Glaceon needs a glacial lure, amongst others. Which means that if you want to evolve one of these Pokemon, you will be absolutely forced to purchase one of these lures. Then there's all of the unnecessary additions with max battles that I already mentioned, being able to purchase max points, max mushrooms, or paying to double your raid rewards. These are all completely beyond the pale. Then there are the big kahunas. These are the items that I suspect make Niantic the most money, which are of course egg incubators and raid passes. Usually players opt not to directly buy these and will instead purchase one of the available boxes. Boxes are usually a bundle of items where the individual price per item ends up being cheaper, but you also spend more money when you buy a box. I won't go over every box deal in the history of the game as there have been so many, but sometimes the deals are really good. For instance, this boost box gives 5 raid passes, 5 super incubators, and 1 Pokemon and item storage upgrade. Buying all of these individually would cost almost 2,000 Pokecoins, but the box only costs 399. Guys, this is such a good deal. We don't know when the boost box is going to be back. I have to buy 100 of them, okay? As an aside, some of these boxes are so hilariously bad, I can't imagine anyone ever bought them. Such as this veteran box for 750 coins that gives literally just berries. Just what every veteran player of the game needs more of, right? I can only imagine the only people buying these sorts of boxes were toddlers just randomly mashing buttons on their parents' phone. Over time, more and more boxes in the game have switched from being payable with Pokecoins to only being payable with real money. However, the worst of the worst are the paid timed research tickets. Many of the events in the game run researches, which are just tasks you do that give you random rewards that are sometimes good. Paid researches are typically the opposite of those. You pay money and the rewards are typically terrible. There have been close to 100 research tickets. Most of them cost $5 and they're all extremely optional, to put it lightly. For instance, the determined pose timed research, which literally only rewarded you with a unique pose for your character to take. However, the ones that upset the community the most were the research tickets that gated special Pokemon. For instance, the Rogue of the Jungle ticket cost $8 and rewarded an additional Zarude. Zarude is this mythical green monkey Pokemon for people not super familiar with modern Pokemon. While players were able to obtain one copy of Zarude previously through free research, selling an additional copy when there's no other way of obtaining the Pokemon feels really scummy. And Zarude isn't even close to the only Pokemon they've done this with. I think they've done it with basically every single mythical. In 2025, Niantic launched the Go Battle Pass. Free path, paid path, very Fortnite core. So to make it more tempting, they dangled some limited use power items as bait. You've got the Timed Incubator, a second unlimited use incubator that expires in a week. The Gold Bottle Cap, it lets you hyper train Pokemon to function like a hundo, but it's still a 14, 13, 14 with abandonment issues. And of course, everyone's favorite, the Lucky Trinket. It makes you instantly lucky friends with someone. No flirting, just a high stakes trade with a stranger at 3 AM. Players loved these items, besides maybe the unlimited use incubator. They do set a dangerous precedent in the future though. Outside of the scummy monetization, the customer support for the game is also horrible. Support tickets on lost or wrongly received items receive anything from bot replies that don't match the issue to players being literally banned for no reason whatsoever. One of the longest running frustration points was raid passes being eaten due to server crashes. You'd be lucky to even receive a single Pokeball as compensation. If you wanted any real customer support, you would need to tweet at them or have a high visibility post on the subreddit. Why is this such a theme with modern companies? They only ever try to fix stuff it makes them look bad. Given the overwhelming financial success of Pokemon Go, it's no surprise that Niantic would try to recreate the experience with other franchises. Wizards Unite was the Harry Potter Lightship Pokemon Go clone, and oh boy, this game was really something else. The gameplay was the same sort of Google Maps overlay, but this time with a Harry Potter theme. Pokestops were replaced with inns, Pokeballs were replaced with energy to cast spells, and Pokemon themselves were replaced by random and repetitive minigames. Catching Pokemon was super easy to port over to Pokemon Go, and it arguably works really well. There wasn't a good analog for this with Harry Potter, so Niantic had to put on their thinking caps to try and come up with something, and they just completely failed. Rescue members of the Ministry of Magic, battle Death Eaters, prevent Muggles from seeing the Weasley's clock. Completing these events would register them as confoundables. It's almost like when Niantic can't copy the homework of a better game, they just can't do anything at all. Objectives in Wizards Unite were simply random and lacked any kind of cohesion that was present in Pokemon Go. One player described the game as Pokemon Go if the Pokemon vanished into nothing after you caught them. Of course, the game also had to feature Niantic's patented AR technology. So now you can see horrifying footage of pixelated goblins poorly overlaid inside of your kitchen. Monetization in Wizards Unite was described as completely out of control by this Forbes article, and in a much worse state than Pogo. You might think that that's impossible, but the traditional Grim Reaper of mobile games are energy systems. And while you could obtain energy in Wizards Unite for free, the system was substantially less forgiving than obtaining Pokeballs in Pokemon Go. And on top of this, the game had the same inventory management problems Pogo did, but apparently it was like 10 times worse. In September of the year it shut down, Wizards Unite had made a measly $200,000, while Pogo raked in over $60 million. Since Pogo's player base was so much bigger than Wizard Unite's, I think that part of the decision to shut it down probably had to do with not being able to get as much player data from it. Luckily for all of you Niantic fans out there, and I know there are so many of you, Wizards Unite wasn't even close to the last game they would try making. Pikmin Bloom was launched in 2021 as kind of like a light version of Pogo. It features less FOMO, it has step-based gameplay instead of distant-based, and less location-based goals. It's also significantly less grindy and requires way less phone interaction time. At least one reviewer called it a Pikmin-themed fitness game rather than a traditional game. The reception of the game was really mixed, with hardcore players of Pikmin completely bouncing off of it. If you're unaware, Pikmin is at its core a real-time strategy game where you battle monsters and then use their corpses to create additional Pikmin. There isn't anything remotely like that in Pikmin Bloom. In fact, many fans of the series wondered why anyone who's a fan of Pikmin would even want to touch the game. And while researching it, I found that many people that liked it only liked it just because it was a light version of Pokemon Go. You know it's bad when people were saying they wished Pikmin Bloom was more like Animal Crossing Pocket Camp. And not that it would have been like Animal Crossing, but more so that it would have been more similar to the main series game it was inspired by, rather than a glorified pedometer. Monster Hunter Now is yet another game that Niantic gave the Pogo treatment. If you don't know, Monster Hunter is a franchise that's focused on combat with giant monsters that you can kill and turn into hats. Niantic heard this and thought, holy smokes, this would make a great augmented reality game. Pokemon was lightning in a bottle because collecting hundreds of cute monsters already felt like a real-world scavenger hunt. Pikmin is about enslaving plant monsters to haul corpses, Monster Hunter is about carving giant lizards into hats. None of that stuff really screams walk around outside and collect stuff. So here we've reached it, the end of Pokemon Go. On May 29th, 2025, Pokemon Go was sold for $3.5 billion to Scopely. Scopely is most well known for being the game publisher that turns your favorite childhood franchises into psychologically weaponized slot machines. Scopely itself was actually previously purchased by the Savvy Games Group, which is part of the Saudi government investment fund, for $4.9 billion itself. But don't you worry, trainers, the Saudi government shares Scopely's mission statement to have a satisfied and thriving player base. There were a lot of concerns raised over the location data that Niantic has on the entire player base being part of the sale. Scopely emphasized that protecting player privacy and data is of the utmost importance to both Scopely and Niantic. And it seems like historical player data was not part of the sale, but no doubt Scopely will be able to quickly and effectively create a new dataset. This raised the alarm of privacy watchdogs, though it's hard to prove anything nefarious is happening right now. Well, what's happening to Niantic itself? They laid off a bunch of their employees for one thing, and they created a new spin-off company called Niantic Spatial, which is focused on AR and mapping technology. This isn't really surprising when you remember that the CEO is completely obsessed with a future where Eevee can leave a diarrhea trail you can follow to find a barbershop or something. The player reaction to this announcement was mixed to say the least. Many players hoped that Scopely would address a lot of the outstanding issues with the game. This would include things like lowering the cost of remote raid passes, removing the cap on remote raids done per day, which is really funny because all those things would just involve giving more money to Scopely. The other half braced for doom, terrified of things like in-game banner ads, subscriptions, or increased and more aggressive monetization models. Well, believe it or not, since Scopely purchased Pokemon Go, they decided to allow remote raid shadow battles and max battles. They also doubled the limit of the remote raid passes per day and increased the rewards for max battles and the max number of max particles you could hold. However, here's the key thing, okay? This was not actually Scopely. This was Niantic. Niantic is for some reason still in charge of Pokemon Go. Of course, this didn't stop the player base from prematurely celebrating that Scopely was saving the game. As of the making of this video, I think we don't really know what Scopely's actual plans are for the game. But the one thing that I can tell you for certain is that no matter what happens, Pokemon Go will never return to the summer of 2016. Back then, the game wasn't just a mobile app, it was a literal cultural event. These days, it's an overmilked, bloated cash cow that's failed to live up to its potential. However, okay, I need to say this. I am absolutely not condemning anyone that still plays Pokemon Go in 2025. In fact, I still kind of log into the game every once in a while. The active users have gone down over the years, but it's still holding strong at 50 to 60 million active users per month. And in fact, there's a running joke in the player base that when people talk about how Pokemon Go is dead, they have no idea about how many active players there still are. That being said, it's still a huge downgrade from what it used to be. In the end, the game wasn't really about Niantic or Scopely or even Pokemon. It was about the memories and friends you made, and also the decision to engage with strangers in a time where people are more isolated than ever. So if you still play Pokemon Go, honestly, good for you. Please just don't give Niantic too much money, or Scopely, okay? Don't liquefy your brain anymore. Well, that's it. This video was a colossal undertaking and it felt impossible to organize in any way that made actual sense. I also left out a lot of stuff that I could have talked about, but I think that most of that stuff probably wasn't actually that interesting. That being said, if you made it through the whole thing, congratulations. You're now entitled to one free Lugia. Maybe. I'd like to give a big thank you to my co-conspirator, PlushyPath, aka Stephanie, who helped write a large portion of this video. If you did spot a mistake, which I'm sure there were many of, feel free to correct me. I know you're dying to. But that's gonna do it for this one. Thank you for watching, and bye bye for now.